Good morning, everybody, and welcome. I'd like to echo Dan's sentiment of congratulations. Congratulations to all of you on having made it to the semifinals and having an opportunity to now be overwhelmed by what it actually will take to start the business that you're proposing. So that's enough blowing smoke. Now I'll get to the reality. And as you can see, what I've titled this talk is Why You're Wrong. So as soon as you get here, now we're going to tell you all the reasons why this is going to be really hard. The reason why I titled it this way is that if there's one thing that I have learned in 15 years now of investing in startup biotech companies, it's that I am wrong every day. You go through academia and are taught to come up with the right answer, and you do all of your market research to come up with your opportunity and match that with the technology and come up with what is supposed to be, the idea. And then you get out into the real world and find out that none of that actually works. And you have to be adaptable and ready to not only understand what is different from what you expected, but then start to anticipate that so that you could be prepared for it the next time. So being wrong is actually a good thing, and that's what I'll talk about. But first, let's see if does this actually control? Yes. But first, I'll give you some context. All of you, again, have come here with some combination of a technology or a product idea and a market opportunity. But in the life sciences, that can take many different forms. And so just to sort of set the stage, especially for those of you who may be coming from one area and not familiar with the others, I'd like to compare and contrast a little bit of the different business models. So my main focus is in therapeutics. So this is drug development, making either a large molecule or a small molecule that is given to a patient in order to treat a disease. What we know about this is a lot more now on the molecular pathways involved in disease, and so the opportunity to modulate this seems to be clearer in many cases than it was even a few years ago. And it has a huge emphasis on the intellectual property protecting that idea, a clinical development path, the regulatory environment that the Food and Drug Administration in the United States or other regulatory agencies imposes before you can actually sell a drug. And so what this means for the business is that there's a huge cost for clinical testing and to move through this regulatory process, but also a huge payoff in having a drug that is both protected from competition and relatively unique, hopefully, in the treatment of disease. As we move sort of from therapeutics down into other business models, the barrier to entry changes, and as a result, the revenue expectations but also the cost going in also change. So in the medical device space, where we're talking about implantable physical devices that are also intended to treat a disease, where, again, IP and a clinical development cycle is still the central feature, it has been that one can get a device approved based on a precedent of an existing device that's already on the market, which makes for a slightly easier challenge. So there's a little bit of a shorter timeline in theory, and I'll get to that a little bit more. Research tools, on the other hand, are pieces of equipment or reagents that can be used in a lab, whether it's in an academic setting or in an industrial drug discovery setting, that enables a scientist to do something that they couldn't do without it. In this area, though, there is a much lower barrier to entry. There's no regulatory process. You can come up with your box and sell it. So it's important to get into that market quickly and for a relatively small upfront cost. But at the same time, you're asking labs to buy what is sometimes a substantial piece of equipment for a meaningful upfront cost, knowing that there are other tools coming right behind that are going to make that obsolete, or new discoveries of different approaches that will make that tool obsolete. So it's a much more rapidly iterating business cycle than you would see in a therapeutic space. Similarly with diagnostics, on the one hand, it's somewhat easy, quote unquote easy, to come up with a test for a particular analyte or reagent or some biomarker, but then you have to decide what format will that test be applied in the marketplace, who's going to actually run the test on a day-to-day basis, and what will physicians be able to do with the information that the diagnostic yields. So there is, I guess, more of an intellectual barrier there, and typically more of a centralized market where there are a few large diagnostics companies, and they tend to run most of the volume of these sorts of tests, and you have to decide, are you going to work with them or not? And then again, when there is a relevant decision that a physician can make based on this diagnostic, the question is usually, how is that changing the cost environment? Am I saving money by spending some money on this test in order to better optimize care for patients? And then finally, in the healthcare IT space, or I know this year we had a lot of wearable applications. So for those of you developing wearables, this also falls into this category where you're primarily driven by software. So the speed to develop a product can be much faster, but this is still a hugely fragmented market and depends entirely on building something that either consumers or patients and physicians will adopt and, again, find some benefit for the cost that you're asking them to spend up front. So in general, as the barrier to entry decreases going down the slide, or increases going up the slide, I should say, the harder it is for someone to compete with that product once it gets on the market, the larger the potential for revenue for any one use case of that product. And that becomes really important, as you'll see over the course of the weekend, in terms of the modeling out what you need to do to make this a viable business that's attractive to investors, that generates some interesting value and return for the company itself. And again, each of these areas encounters, I would say, different hurdles along the way. I mentioned that, and I think most of you are familiar with, that in the therapeutic space, we go from basic research, figuring out what the actual drug is going to be, and a series of non-clinical or animal model testing, toxicology testing, 3 different phases of clinical development, where one is primarily looking first for safety and later for efficacy, either in a proof of concept or then in the larger population that you intend to use the drug in. And then finally, a regulatory phase where it could take another year on top of all of this work to get the FDA to review and hopefully approve the product. Medical devices in the past, as I had mentioned, have been fortunate to take advantage of what in the United States is referred to as a 510(k) application, where a precedent device serves as a basis for arguing that this new device will be safe to put into people, and therefore we can go ahead and do that. And in general, that's required relatively small clinical data, if any. You still have to go through the animal testing and optimization path and do some work in man, but when you can take the 510(k) path, it's a much more streamlined route to market. And that has now changed quite substantially, actually, in the last 5 to 10 years. It's moved into a state where the FDA now, to a much greater extent, requires more clinical testing to demonstrate the efficacy of a new device, and even if there is a precedent, has to go, will push companies to go through the full PMA, which is analogous to the NDA for therapeutics, where there's a full clinical data set required. And of course, this now means that developing a medical device can take much longer, similar to a traditional sort of molecular therapeutic. Diagnostics are also regulated as devices, but still can go through a much more streamlined approval process if it's going to be used in a certified lab setting. There's still a lot of back and forth within the regulatory agencies around what's referred to as homebrew tests, where you're essentially running it out of a lab as opposed to a clinical lab. But really, some data with showing the impact of this diagnostic test on ultimately patient health and the outcome of what a treating physician will see as the outcome when they provide care to a patient is still very important. And then in the tools and IT space, these are generally either not regulated from a FDA perspective. Some in IT, of course, there's a huge amount of data privacy and patient privacy concerns and regulations. But from a product perspective, this is just now open market competition. You have to get out there with the product, sell it to the people who are going to buy it, and then hope that you can stay ahead of the curve and the competition. As a result of these different sort of requirements to bring a product to market, companies that are pursuing these types of products have sort of different propositions and I guess value proposition is the best way to say it, to investors. So why should an investor put money into your company to help with product development and get to market? Well, it's because they feel like they're going to make a return on that investment. And you'll hear a lot more about the mechanics of that and the mathematics of that. But from a sort of qualitative perspective, what are investors looking for? Well, again, the return that an investor will see on their investment is defined by the value at exit. So this is at the time when a company is acquired or at some point as a public company where there is a public market for the company shares, divided by the amount of capital invested that it took to get to that point. And this exit value is generally based on the revenue potential, which again, as I had mentioned, is very much dependent on what space you're in, what the barrier to entry is, how hard it is for others to compete. And even in the same company, early investors and later investors may see a different return on their investment. If you put in $10 on day one, that's a lot different than putting in $100 after 3 years of work. And we refer to the return on investment, or ROI, in two different ways, right? One is just the absolute cash on cash. So if I put in $10 and I get $100 back at the end of the day, that's a 10x return, cash on cash. Or the internal rate of return, or IRR, which is expressed as a percentage, which takes into account the time that it took for me to get that return from the point at which I originally invested. And again, you'll hear a lot more about the math of that later. But looking at different businesses, investors will have different questions and want to understand different features of both the technology and the business to decide if they want to invest in it. In therapeutics, again, you're looking at innovative science, new molecular entities, but also recognizing that there's an expensive clinical development path that needs to be taken. Is there some validation up front? Are there animal model experiments that we have data from? Is there something that tells me that if I put all of this money and work and time into developing this new molecule, I have a reasonable chance of success? Because the averages are not very reasonable, and we'd like to be above that if possible. With medical devices, assuming you can get to market a little more quickly, and actually nowadays, even if you don't, ultimately, what acquirers are looking for is a product that's being sold, that's being used in patients, and has a sales trajectory that can be modeled at least from some initial sales ramp. And a common question you'll get in this space is, are we developing a device to replace some expensive, invasive surgical procedure, for example, that now can be made simpler, safer, and more cost-effective? In the tool space, again, we're more focused on the sales cycle and what is the capital infrastructure that you're asking a lab to purchase or work with versus disposable reagents. And the question is really, what does the lab need, right? How can we identify the specific research need that over a large number of users generates a market for this product? Which is often not straightforward because labs are taking different approaches. There's always some new technique that people are trying to implement. So finding that need can sometimes be a hard part up front. In the diagnostic space, again, the question is, what value are we adding to clinical decision making? And therefore, the question is there already a use for the data? Can I go to a physician today and say, if you're making a decision based on this current information, what would you do if you had the opportunity for some additional information? As opposed to, hey, I've got this great test for a new biomarker, now let's figure out what we're going to do with it, which is a very different question. And in the IT space, again, much of it is driven by cost. And the ultimate payer for some digital system is often an insurance company or the end reimburser for that type of technology is going to ask, what's in it for me? How is this going to reduce the overall cost of care that I'm spending on all of the covered patients that I'm working with? So just as the lower barrier to entry means it's easier to get into the market and generate revenue, but you have a faster sales cycle, et cetera, to keep that revenue going. In general, the more capital and time that's required to get to the market, the higher the exit valuation has to be. If it's going to take you $100 million to bring a drug to market, which is actually pretty cheap, so it's actually pretty low relative to industry averages, I should say. Obviously that company needs to be worth $1 billion or more for investors to get a 10x return, as opposed to a wearable that costs me $100,000 to get to market, and maybe it only generates $100 million in revenue as opposed to $3 billion. But again, the exit value can be lower in order to make a return on investment. Okay, so those are sort of the fundamentals in 10 easy steps. Whatever market you're in, whatever product space you're in, you're going to be putting together a business plan, and you'll hear a lot more about this as we go through the weekend in excruciating detail. But I've just put up some suggested questions that really every business plan will need to address. And you don't need to copy this down. You'll have access to the slides, I'm sure, afterwards. But basically, we're developing a product, we're developing a business, which means we have a starting point. Where are you today? Who are the people involved? Why are you the right people to start this company? If not, continue to manage it going forward. What is the market opportunity that we've identified, and how can we capture some of that value using the product that we're developing? In order to get there, we've got some requirement, either technical development or the clinical and regulatory path that we've described. There are going to be risks and various things that are hurdles, and also areas that you don't know whether they will be hurdles or not. And so the business plan is trying to anticipate the bumps along the way that the company will have to encounter and overcome in order to in order to bring a product to market. In order to do that, you need money, time, and people. And so how much of each is going to be required? And ultimately, the goal is how well is this product going to address the need that we identified at the beginning? Or do we have a hugely differentiated product that nobody else can match in the market? Do we have an incremental benefit that may be still meaningful for those who are going to use it, but has to be sold to just those particular people? So how is it differentiated from the competition? And ultimately, who's going to be paying for it? If you're going to sell $100 million of something, well, that's $100 million somebody else has to shell out. And so who's going to do that? How are we going to translate this into shareholder value? One thing that's not on here that should be is intellectual property, and how do we protect the product that we're developing from other people and from the competition. I think a business plan should also have that section in there as well. And when I'm talking to startups who are pitching me a business plan for the first time, or talking about their opportunity, I try to push them towards a sort of summary slide, right? One where all of these factors can be easily visualized and digested by an investor. And you'll all find different ways to do this. This is just one example, but if we look over time where we've got 8 quarters or 2 years worth of work here, and we have some program in the company that has to go through various stages and activities along that time to, in this case, we've only gone from compound discovery to first in man testing in those 2 years, which is, it's maybe feasible, but certainly still leaves a lot of time left to get to market. And over that period of time, we have a certain number of people in the company, and that grows over time, that are necessary to carry out these activities. And I like to summarize the cost both by project. So I'm going to spend, in this case, $500,000 to develop the assays here. That expenditure finishes at this point, and then we move on. But I'm going to be spending different amounts for each of those stages. But I'm also going to be spending a total amount over time. So for each quarter, we can sum up the expenses that the company will incur. And ultimately, you get to a number, and in this case, it's almost $7 million that will take this company from the beginning to the end of the second year. And this now tells me really how much do I need to raise from investors in order to build this business. And again, the numbers can be vastly different depending on which business area you're in. Okay, so that's the background, that's the context. You're going to hear a ton more about all of those features of building a business over the next couple of days and months. But let me get back to the premise that I started with, which is that you're wrong about everything you just put into that plan. And that's okay, because so is everybody else. So the question is not, how do we avoid being wrong? The question is, how do we deal with being wrong? And I illustrate this with an infographic that you can find on the internet around the kinds of cognitive biases that all human beings encounter when making decisions that cause us to make incorrect decisions, either based on our interpretation of the world or our selective perception of the world. So for example, confirmation bias, right? We tend to hear information that confirms what we already believe to be true, and we ignore information that counteracts or contradicts what we believe to be true, and therefore everything sounds like what we already know. We can, what are some other good ones? People always have a blind spot. You know about the placebo effect, where you might believe that you're getting better even though you haven't taken anything except an empty gelatin capsule. You know, actually, what was another one that was going to come? Well, I won't go through all of these. Overconfidence is one that everyone is going to be suffering from. You will not, at the end of this weekend, be suffering from this. And then, you know, something like an anchoring bias, where we tend to respond more strongly or remember better the first piece of information that we hear, which is why I like to go first in the weekend. So how do all of those issues crop up as you're implementing a business plan or even creating a business plan? So first of all, you're wrong about your product. On each of these slides, you'll see some of the cognitive biases that may relate, but really, I'll have some messages down at the bottom, and that's what I'll leave you with. But you each have an idea, and your idea sounds great. It will always sound better to you than it will to anybody else, simply because it's your idea and not theirs. But in reality, the new thing is not always better. It may be new, but the question is, how is this product really going to satisfy some need in the market? And so, being objective requires you to ask, what are the limitations of this product? What can't it do? Are there certain patients that it won't be good for? Are there certain researchers who won't want to use this? And therefore, can I drive towards those that it will be useful for? So you always have to assess the competitive landscape, what's going on out in the world that determines who will be interested in your product and who won't. What is the standard of care? What is the cost? Et cetera. And even when you think you know what this is going to look like over the next few years, things can change much more rapidly or in different directions than we anticipate. And so since product development does take a long time, you have to continually be aware of that environment and adjust accordingly. You're usually wrong about your data. I like to think back to my PhD, which I'm actually surprised that they gave me now that I think about it, because the central finding that my thesis was based on, I had to squint to see, is that signal real, or am I fooling myself based on having done these measurements and believing that it reflects something real in biology, but being subject to my observation. And really, in any kind of biological system or in clinical development, we're dealing with statistics. We're dealing with probability. The best that we can do is to say, gee, this event is probably not random chance, right? That's as good as it gets. And so if you're dealing in that type of uncertainty, and unfortunately, we can't simply run, 5 parallel experiments with different controls in order to see which one works, right? If you could start 10 versions of your company and fast forward a few years and say, well, which one of those strategies paid off? That's the one you would do. We can't do that in real life. So how will we have to continually ask, how robust is this data? How reproducible are the data that we're working with? Does it only pertain to a certain genetic population, a certain background? What else do we need to demonstrate to put as much confidence around the biology that we can? You're wrong about your market. This is an easy one because, again, we can forecast what the current population of patients are with a certain disease. We can understand what those patients or the reimbursement, the providers, the healthcare providers that they are working with currently pay for treatment or hospitalization or whatever it is as some analogy, right? As a surrogate marker for what we will ultimately be able to generate in selling this product. But it also depends on pricing, right? I mean, if you can price a drug at $300,000 a year, that's a lot different than if you can only price it at $200,000 a year or $20,000 a year. And so the ultimate market forecast is really a guide to say, is this an opportunity worth pursuing or not? And the great example of this is Rituxan, which is a anti-CD20 antibody that was developed at Genentech and IDEC at the time for non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. It's now been on the market 20 years. It's sold more than $45 billion worth over its life and continues to. But the original forecast was $150 million a year, right? It blew through that in the first, 2 years it was on the market, at a time when no other antibody, or hardly any other antibodies were on the market. So this was just a huge underestimate, and in fact, allowed IDEC to capture a huge amount of value because Genentech didn't think it would be that big of a product. Now, could have gone the other way, and this happens as well. But in either case, you're pretty much going in that whatever market forecast you come up with, it's an estimate. You're wrong about your business model, again, for the same reason that whatever we think the approach is today that's going to get us to a product on the market, things change over time. And therefore, what you create as a static business model can't be true because it will have to be dynamic, it will have to change, you'll have to adjust to whatever else happens in the world. I mentioned in the device space, we had a shift from primarily a 510K approval process to now an increasingly PMA requiring process. So it took the time way out, investment in medical devices declined, became a much harder space. In diabetes, there was a point in time when the FDA said, you know what, every new diabetes product is going to have 2-year carcinogenicity studies in rodents before we can approve it. And so all of a sudden you had to factor this into the model of, all right, it's going to take me that additional amount of time and effort. And again, investment in the diabetes space declined for a good long time, really. I mentioned drug pricing. If changes in the political environment make it so that the government steps in and restricts the amount that we can charge, or if Shkreli gets up in front of too many congressional panels and this all goes to hell, that's going to affect the exit plans of not only us sitting in the room, but all of the pharma companies as well, which we're dependent upon for exits, et cetera. So there are a lot of things that can change, and you can't predict the future. So really the approach to be thinking about is, imagine anything, and if that happened, how would you adjust? What would you change? What would you need to be doing today to put yourself in a position where if this change in the market takes place, we're ready to adapt to that? And it may mean pivoting entirely, right? It may mean taking this technology in a completely different direction. So, and that's okay. It's all a matter of what does the business need to continue to move forward. You're definitely wrong about your team, and for this I apologize. But I mentioned overconfidence. Really, there is no one team that has all of the experience necessary to take a company from inception to the market and beyond. You're going to have people who are really good at pitching a story to the public markets. You're going to have people who are really good at understanding how the competitive dynamic leads to what we need to do to build a sales force. You're going to have people who are really good at understanding what piece of data you absolutely have to convince others, right? And you've all come with a foundation for a company. You may very well be involved with that company and take it, and be part of the company forever. You may not. And that's okay also, because just because it is your company doesn't mean that you're necessarily the best person to run that company 2 years from now. Now, right now, no one else is going to do it, so you're it, right? But as you grow, you will be able to bring other people into the company, expertise that you need, experience that you need, other skill sets, and over time, the company as an entity will need different management composition. And it is okay to play that role. There are plenty of really excellent scientists who have founded multiple companies, and they can be the founder of a company and benefit from it, and let it go, and off it goes. And they can do it again. And there are people who have been the CEO of their company, which is now a multi-billion-dollar publicly traded entity, for a long, long time. In general, though, the message that I want to leave you with is, if you start to think, gee, is this person really right for the role? It's probably already too late. Okay, so pay attention to those warning signs or questions that come up, because by the time you're thinking about it and you're wondering, should I say something, you probably should have said something 6 months ago. You're definitely wrong about your investors, and I know a lot of people will refer to venture capital in a different light. Being part of the venture capital community, I can say this is absolutely true. Financial investors especially have a portfolio of companies. They're investing funds across 10, 20 companies in a given cohort, which means that they're doing that because they know not all of those are going to succeed. So at the end of the day, if they have 4 other ones that look great, it's okay if yours fails, right, from an investment perspective. So you have to recognize that investors will, in fact, be motivated by self-interest, which is defined as greed and fear in some ratio, and therefore are not necessarily aligned with you, whose vision is that this company will be successful, which is the attitude that every entrepreneur has to have in order to keep their company going. If you don't believe that, it's not going to happen. But you have to understand that the other people that you need along the way will have their own views, their own motivations. And so, do your homework. What is their background? Where are they in their fund cycle? What other companies have they invested in? Do they even have the expertise in your particular area that you'd like to have on your board or around the company? What can we expect from this particular person? Talk to other companies that they've invested in, see how they've behaved, that sort of thing. And expect to manage your board, manage your investors, just as they will be managing you. But there is one quality that you can't get really anywhere else. As an advisor to the company, as somebody to help, there's a huge amount of experience inherent in somebody who's been investing for a long time. And really, it's that they've made these mistakes before, right? Whatever it is that you're going to encounter, they've seen 3 other companies either falter or overcome that exact same problem. And so that kind of feedback, that kind of sort of awareness is hugely valuable and shouldn't be underestimated. You're definitely wrong about your risks. So although this is a tricky subject. So we can ignore the risks. We can believe that those that have made it past certain risks are illustrative of the fact that we can do that as well. We cannot understand why someone else was able to succeed where we've run into a wall. But at the end of the day, risk is just the possibility of loss, right? It's by definition, it's something that either suggests a hazard or creates the possibility of loss. But this definition really assumes that there's some threshold below which there's no risk, right? There's some magical state that is risk-free, and then on top of that, something can increase the probability of loss, right? Well, that threshold, in my experience, is so far below zero that it's not even really worth talking about. Everything is a risk. Everything can go wrong. There's always a possibility of loss. So we have to recognize that we don't know what we don't know. There's always the chance that something's not going to go according to plan. So how do you behave with that perspective? And I try to espouse the view that risk, as we judge it qualitatively, and we'll get to quantitative risk later, but qualitatively, risk is an illusion. It's all just a degree of probability that what we're doing is going to work or not work. And so what I encourage you to focus on is the question of how do we figure out whether a particular activity will generate value, and if it will, how do we generate the maximum value possible with a minimal amount of effort? So don't think about it as, there are these things that could go wrong. It's what do you need to do to get the value creation you're looking for. And I won't try doing a Yoda voice, that's terrible. And ultimately, the same goes for value. Value is what is defined again as a fair return, the monetary worth of something, but really it's the relative worth that I would encourage you to focus on. Value is in the eye of the beholder, just like beauty. It's all dependent upon what the market will bear, right? What will someone else pay to invest in your company or buy your product or whatever it is? And no one else will ever value you the way that you do, both positively and negatively. And so what you can do is focus on the fundamentals, right? Focus on what's necessary to build your business, to take advantage of the opportunity you see, to get the product where you can get it. And then, let the market take care of the valuation. People, if you have, the best case scenario is that you have multiple offers, right? You have multiple investors who want to invest, you have multiple pharma companies that want to buy you, and that dynamic, that competition among the buyers is what creates greater value. But that's not something that you can sort of create out of thin air. You just have to build a business and let it come. So the one thing that we're all right about is being wrong. No plan survives the first contact. Whatever business plan you have, it's going to be a living document. It's going to be something that changes over time. And the best that we can do is to be bold about it, go for it, but be aware of the things that might change, that might not be as we expect them on day one. And at the end of the day, which I'm sure you'll appreciate, there's no substitute for just the hard work. It takes time, it takes effort, and it takes dedication. And if you do that, hopefully the rest will follow. But again, don't take my word for it just because I put some images that I pulled off the internet on a slide, right? Most of the things that you find on the internet are wrong. Abraham Lincoln did not say this, right? This is a real book, however, which I found to be just a great read. And so if you're interested in, getting into the psychology of this a little bit more, you can look up this book. But I will leave you with the idea that what you're doing in building a business and creating a company is akin to driving a car on a road. There's going to be curves, there are going to be bumps, you just don't necessarily know where they are. And they can take many different forms, right? Reproducing data, delays, IP, whatever, recruiting the right team, all of these things. And so just like, cars now have adaptive headlights that follow the road for you and make sure your headlights are always focused in the right place, be open and active in bringing advice into the company. You need advisors, investors, management, people who have been down similar roads before, know where the turns are likely to be and can help you anticipate those, plan for them, and then adjust the plan when they're wrong. So good luck.